Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnacca, and my co-host Robert Brant and I are joined today by Catherine Pennington, Director, Indigenous Advisory Services, KPMG Canada, where she discussed her background in social work and transition to the energy sector. She emphasized the importance of Indigenous relations in corporate projects, citing Bill C-5's components on labor mobility and project expediting in particular. Pennington highlighted KPMG's Truth and Reconciliation Action Plan and its focus on Indigenous equity, commercial structuring, and financing. She noted the need for skilled Indigenous relations professionals and the role of international models in guiding Canada's practices. Pennington also stressed the significance of Indigenous participation in major projects, including infrastructure and energy, to unlock billions in private investment necessary for these projects to come to fruition.
Catherine Pennington, the Director of Indigenous Advisory Services at KPMG. Great of you to join us today on Drumbeats.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much. It's such an opportunity to spend some time with the two of you on some very important discussions.
Yes, great to have you with us, Catherine. So why don't we get into it? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where did you grow up and how does your educational background and work experience shape your path to where you are today? And you have some items you'll have to talk about sometime during the conversation.
I certainly will. Thanks again for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. So I'm joining you today on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lheidli T'enneh people in north central British Columbia, otherwise known as Prince George, BC. And I've had the opportunity to live on this territory as a guest here for about the last 15 years. But I'm originally from Treaty 6 territory in the Métis homeland. I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan by birth, born and raised in a small little community called Duck Lake, Saskatchewan. And I always like to talk about that because it has about 500 people. And for a lot of people in the world, 500 people is a pretty small number. But I think it had like a really significant shaping of me and the way that I see the world and the way that I operate in the world. So a citizen of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan by birth, now a citizen of the Métis Nation of British Columbia based on where I live here. I spent the last 20 some years in the energy sector. But I didn't come to the energy sector in the traditional way. And I don't actually believe that I practice in industry now as the Director of Indigenous Advisory Services for KPMG in maybe the traditional way. So I know that a lot of the conversations that you folks have are around capital markets and investment. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. But my disclaimer is always that you are talking to a social worker and a psychotherapist. I'm not a banker. I don't have a background in technical finance or engineering, but I came into the energy sector from social work. I was working at the time for a number of years in family services and child protection. And I had an opportunity to go into industry. I actually got a phone call one day from a company. We were living in the very far north at the Northwest Territories border of Canada and BC. And there was this opportunity to join, at that time, an Aboriginal relations team. It was an interesting transition. I took the opportunity because I think I knew even then, like 25 years ago, that I could probably do better social work inside an organization, inside a company, and affect change in a way that I was unable to do on the front lines of social work. Now, I have great respect for my peers that, have remained in social work. But for me, I thought if I can affect like Indigenous peoples and jobs and opportunities, and if I can work with communities in a way that's around economic development, that's going to affect everything. That's going to affect jobs and employment, poverty. And really, from my perspective, being a social worker, often I say like at 11 o'clock at night on the doorstep with the RCMP, that's like front end crisis social work. I was more interested in being on the upstream side of social work. So spent a number of years in the energy sector, the upstream, the midstream, and energy transportation on the pipeline sector side. And then over the last few years have transitioned here to KPMG and really love it because it's an opportunity to work with so many different companies and sectors. And I really enjoy that. Most importantly about me is I'm a mother. I have 2 children. My daughter is 18 and in pre-med, studying like biochemistry. I don't know how on earth she can do that. For a social worker, that's really amazing. And my son, who's finishing high school and has a real interest around justice and psychology. So I probably have more in common with him on that side, but very lucky to be a mother and to have 2 amazing children. And my husband and I live here in Prince George, and we really love the North. We've always really loved the North. Growing up in North Central Saskatchewan stays with me. It's like really who I am. So I think I always valued the opportunity to live in Northern Canada. So thank you.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a really interesting backstory, Catherine. And
Yes.
when this podcast goes out, I'm going to forward it to my son, who's a social worker and still on the front lines. But he and I have discussions about, some of the similarities between our work, my work, economic development, and his work on the social side, both trying to achieve better standard of living and outcomes for Indigenous peoples, just in different ways. But that's really interesting how you found your way into the corporate world after starting out on the front lines.
It wasn't a terribly difficult transition. I think coming from a social work and social services background, working predominantly with Indigenous communities at the time around things like social welfare delegation, like the ability for Indigenous communities to have custody and control over child welfare, which continues to be like a really significant challenge for our country. But when I was transitioning, the skills that were needed there were also needed working within industry and community, the ability to listen, to summarize, to understand, to peace build, conflict resolution. So I felt very fortunate that I always worked for companies that really valued that skill set. And I think that it does go to show, Rob, that what you study in life, you may end up doing very different things, but the core skills are what's most important.
Yes, and I think it also speaks to where organizations are today, because when the Indigenous people, First Nations, the Métis, the Inuit, talk about 7 generations and talk about understanding the whole world that we live in, the visible and invisible, that thinking is actually where corporations are going today, right? That's why ESG became an issue and climate change, because we realize this holistic thinking is important. So, kudos to KPMG for bringing you on board, but I think that's just part of the process. And as you said, that's what makes decisions happen, because you have to understand all of that. The top down doesn't work in many places anymore across societies as a whole. We really all have to work together and bring everybody along to get those successful outcomes that we want.
I've recently had the opportunity to speak a little bit about Bill C5, which is, of course, quite a hot topic here in Canada. It's an enactment that has 2 components. One is around labor mobility, which I think is so crucial for our country. We need to be able to move skilled labor, trades, intellectual property across this country barrier-free in order to really meet the moment. And then the other component of that is the other legislation really focused on the expedition of projects and a number of initiatives around that. And one of the things that I think is going to be so crucial, Mark, to your point, is we're going to need, like never before, really skilled Indigenous relations professionals, because those are the people who are on the front line, who are working with Indigenous communities, who are building relationships, who are often the conduit between the corporate and the investment community and the Indigenous community. And I think that mistakes that have been made in the past have been that we have not invested in Indigenous relations departments in the way that we needed to. And for, it's a continuum and an evolution, right? Like we've seen the beginning of my career was really focused around pre-legislation in many cases, was focused on can you get Indigenous people to participate in the supply chain? But there were no systems or processes like to really maximize participation. So that didn't work that well. So that had to evolve and grow. So we've seen like this evolution now to Indigenous communities on the equity front as investors and all of these amazing tools to help Indigenous communities as investors. But, I think what we really need to think about is how do we as corporations facilitate getting to Indigenous-led projects, Indigenous equity and partnerships? Well, it's going to be the people that you invest in who are helping you to build those relationships. So I think the era of having very minimum staff or that being a department low funded, I just think those are over. If you want to build a project in this country, you're going to need the best Indigenous relations people that you can find, and they need to be very skilled, and they will be.
You've talked on two interesting points, coming back to Bill C5 with its two components, because a lot of our listeners and viewers won't understand when you're talking about what do you mean freedom of movement of, to use a European term, freedom of movement across provinces, because there are barriers to skilled individuals moving across with the different trades, et cetera. So that's something that's trying to be addressed. And it looks like there's a lot of momentum with the provincial leaders in that regard, which is just as important. So it's not just how do we work in partnership with the Indigenous community? It's how do we set up Canada to succeed in a very competitive and demanding economic environment. So there's that whole regulation side, as well as how to work successfully within Indigenous peoples who are our rights holders and not just looking, can you solve this little problem for us? They want to participate and learn. You want to participate and learn. So you can end up leading some of these organizations. Perhaps one day KPMG will be led by an Indigenous person. That should be in the realm of possibility for anyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, and I'm certainly not an expert on like labor issues or labor mobility in the country, but I do know just from leading Indigenous skills training programs through a good portion of my career as part of Indigenous relations efforts and working with communities, it is very challenging for organizations and major projects for labor mobility in the country. And that has been a real challenge for us. I think this enactment is looking at ways of alleviating that. And I think, Mark, you're right. There's a deeper appreciation and understanding of this being a really important effort. I think we also are under this existential threat with the Canada-US situation and a recognition that we really need to bolster our internal resources, meaning our people and our human capital, to help us move major projects, to move along and to build that brings everyone along. And there's definitely an ongoing challenge with Indigenous skills, and we really need to invest in that. I mean, I think in this country still, depending on where you are, depending if you're First Nation, Inuit, or Métis, on average, on aggregate, the graduation rate is still around 70% of that of non-Indigenous students, right? So like that's really significant. That's like 30% of our kids are not graduating high school. So we need to be thinking about, I think, in parallel to like major projects and Build Canada, are we also going to be parallel efforts really investing in Indigenous youth so that they have an opportunity, they see themselves in the picture? I like to say that you can't be what you can't see. So we need to help younger people really see an opportunity in the trades, in sectors around major projects, probably in all positions, as that opportunity for the next generation to participate.
Not just about mobility, but capacity building, particularly within Indigenous communities. Catherine, what about KPMG's group, the Indigenous Advisory Services group? What does it look like and what sorts of things do you work on?
Well, the KPMG Indigenous Advisory Services team is like really a dedicated group of professionals that have unique skill sets of working with Indigenous communities. But I always like to, say that it's fascinating to me, like KPMG has been a tax and audit provider. We're really well known for tax and audit. In fact, when I meet people and I say, "Oh, I work for KPMG," they're like, "Oh, are you an accountant or do you work in tax?" And I think, like, the day that I'm doing any math that is a bad day. Like, you should stop whatever I'm doing. I have no capacity for that. I'm as I said, I'm really focused on the social outcomes piece and health. But KPMG has been involved in Indigenous communities. There's some communities that some of our tax and audit team have been working with for like over 20 years. I think that speaks to the depth of relationship. Like, this is a firm that understands the importance of relationship. There's a very difficult space to work in. So I think it really speaks to long-term relationships and the company's interest in investing, the firm's interest in investing. And investing is exactly what they did. In the advisory space, which is outside of tax and audit, over the last few years, there's been ongoing recognition and investment of hiring people like myself to come in and lead Indigenous Advisory Services. We have a larger Indigenous client services team that focuses on all of the aspects of the firm, and this is growing. It also stems from our Truth and Reconciliation Action Plan, which, unlike other corporate plans that I've seen and been involved in, is very detailed. So when you look at our Truth and Reconciliation Action Plan, which I should just note, I think is amazing because we were the first of the Big Four firm to invest in developing a Truth and Reconciliation Action Plan.
Catherine, can you just give for our viewers and listeners a bit of background, Truth and Reconciliation Plan, just a short summary again to reinforce where that came from and why, and an enterprise such as KPMG saw that was important to do.
Thanks, Mark. So Truth and Reconciliation Plans, or Truth and Reconciliation Action Plans, otherwise known as reconciliation plans, have become significantly more popular among the corporate Canadian landscape over the last 5 or 6 years. Now, it's been 10 years in this country since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its report and findings. And that was a significant national undertaking that interviewed residential school survivors, Indian residential school survivors, Indian day school school survivors, and also focused on health institutions. And it uncovered, of course, I think as most people know, the atrocities that occurred in the residential school system. It identified acts of colonization that had all acts of colonization had a detrimental outcome, but in particular as it related to the schools. And with that, put forward a number of reports and calls to action. And one of the subset of calls for action was for the Canadian corporate sector to take action around employment and skills and training and awareness to ensure that Canadians were aware of what happened. And I'm certain that I think, Rob, you've probably spoken about this, and maybe others of your guests have, that residential school survivors and the legacy of residential schools is not a 200 or 300-year-old thing. For many of us, our parents, our grandparents, our aunties and uncles and cousins went. In my family, I have, family members that went to residential school. There are those of us that are the first gen that were not in residential school. So I think that, it's a very real legacy that we're living. It accounts for the trauma that we've seen in communities that, of course, addresses what I talked about earlier. It impacts child welfare and incarceration and poverty. So it is not a long ago problem. It is a very recent thing that is still affecting our communities today. So corporate Canada, many organizations in corporate Canada either have or are taking action through developing of these plans that help them to map out the mechanisms and the resources and the steps that they're going to take as a corporation or an institution to address it. So KPMG is an illustration. We focus on education of our internal staff. We have 10,000 people. It really moves the needle when you invest in your people understanding the legacy of residential schools, of colonization, of systemic racism, which of course, affects up until recently the ability of Indigenous communities and institutions to even borrow money to invest in economic development. Like, we're seeing a real sea change there. But institutionally, our Truth and Reconciliation Plan is also focused on investing in youth. It's around employment and training and hiring, and around retention and best practices of how we serve our clients. And we've done an update report. We launched our initial report in 2022. We did an update report for 2023 and 2024, and we're into a refresh now for 2025. But we take our Truth and Reconciliation Action Plan very seriously, and it influenced the firm's steps around building out Indigenous advisory services. So we focus on a number of different areas. We work with Indigenous communities, we work with government, and we work with industry on a variety of topics and interests as it relates to working with Indigenous communities. And an area for us that has really been growing and really been focused is our team that works on equity and commercial structuring and financing, and equity benefits and participation, helping Indigenous communities to really maximize their opportunity. So there's kind of that link between the Truth and Reconciliation Action Plan and the work that we do at KPMG and the interconnection. And we're located across the country. We have a national model. And, these days we're very focused on infrastructure and capital projects and sustainability. But we also have a division at KPMG within advisory that focuses on health and child welfare and social outcomes. So the social worker in me loves to be in both spaces here. I get to satisfy my interest in all areas.
KPMG published in this year their private capital study demonstrating that CIB-backed projects could unlock over $30 billion in additional private investment across Canada. How do you see Indigenous participation contributing to that? And what does that really mean for everyone?
Yes. I mean, first of all, that report identified a couple of really critical things, right? Like this unprecedented need around certain aspects like connectivity and major projects and climate adaptation, identified that overwhelmingly business leaders were very positive and felt very strongly about the development of a national energy corridor, modernization of ports, and the importance of modernizing supply chain. I think that when we look at building anything in Canada, it is going to require Indigenous participation. I think gone are the days that you're going to build and move forward without Indigenous participation. I think probably every guest you've had has probably reinforced that message. It is a non-optional requirement. And in order to move a project forward, especially for those projects that want to be a part of the Bill C5, be on this project's list under Bill C5 and the expeditiousness of these permitting associated with major projects, you are going to need Indigenous partners like never before. And I think that it will mean that in many cases, projects will not just have equity opportunities and the opportunity for equity participation. It might mean co-developed and co-led. And I think that this, to look at partnerships through the development and through the crystallization of what that project is going to look like. So my sense is that it is necessary for proponents to establish early relationships, very much like grassroots up instead of top down. And that is going to require incredible skill set to work with communities early on in the process to have buy-in. And how you're going to get that is through not only addressing the environment and social issues, which are always critical for communities. Like the most important thing is around environment and social issues. But then following that is the economic participation pathway. Now, not all communities are going to be necessarily interested in equity. There may be certain projects or certain reasons why equity is not of interest, but that's then going to look at other opportunities around revenue sharing or benefits agreements, inclusion in the supply chain. Very robust agreements are going to be the requirements for the foundation for the future. And we're seeing that. And of course, we're seeing Indigenous-led projects in this country, like Silisms and Cedar LNG and Oneida battery storage, right? There are many, many illustrations and examples of that. So I think the report highlights the need for capital and capital investment in order to get there, we're going to need Indigenous participation.
And Catherine, has KPMG identified foreign investors as a potential source? Do you see a need for foreigners to get involved, or can the Canadian capital markets provide what is needed, do you think?
Well, this is where I take the social worker disclaimer and say I'm not an expert in capital markets or finance, but I mean, my understanding is that we are going to need investment and capital investment from a global source in order to meet the moment. We have significant projects and interests and infrastructure dreams in this country. It is a big country, not a lot of people. We're going to need resources from investors. And we've seen an emergence in Canada over the last number of years. Many of your guests talked about the Indigenous Loan Guarantee programs and the provincial programs and Cedar Leaf Capital and other investment tools that are available, even utilizing life insurance companies and other mechanisms to help fund for ownership and participation, ensuring that the rate is appropriate so that, the return on investment is maximized for Indigenous communities. But I think as a country, we're going to need those investors. And Rob, I remember when I was working in an ESG capacity in a large company, I learned that our ESG evaluators were almost always from overseas. They would be from Scandinavia, which was quite common. And the way that those ESG evaluators would determine our corporate scorecard was often by news clips. It was often by social media news clips. There wasn't much, if any, on the ground interviews of Indigenous communities. So what would happen would be, working for a pipeline company, you can imagine when you do a scan in social media, or you do a scan online, what you see is a negative response. You see old footage, or you see perhaps curated footage, and that sends an international investor a message that this is not a place to do business, this is not a good investment. And many of those messages talk about, long tenured projects a decade ago that were not necessarily successful because of challenges that were occurring. We've evolved since then. And Indigenous communities, by and large, although not a monolith, are not opposed to development, but they are certainly opposed to development that was done from a top-down process that did not respect their rights or their interests and did not include them. So I think that we do need capital investors, and we need those investors to know and appreciate and understand that maybe what they see in the news is not necessarily the truth. And I think podcasts like this are helping to get information out in a world that is often full of information and not necessarily correct information.
Yeah, this podcast and also our summit, our annual Indigenous Investment Summit in London, one of the primary reasons for doing that was to change the message and the perception that foreign investors sometimes often had when it came to development in Canada, that frustrations from the past. So the message is that things have changed. It sounds like you're encouraged, at least by where we are today and how far we've come, say, in the last 5 to 10 years.
I am so encouraged, and I'm also very optimistic. I'm encouraged because, I think this is fascinating. So I think most Canadians would agree that the regulatory and legislative systems that have been in place over the last 8 to 10 years have been very restrictive and very challenging. And as a result, we have not seen as many major projects move through the regulatory process because it was very cumbersome and very complex. And I think many Indigenous communities would agree with that. And yet, interestingly enough, maybe even in spite of that, or because of those complex systems, we've seen this incredible momentum in the marketplace of the federal Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. Over 20 years ago, I remember working with the federal government and Indigenous communities to get drilling rig loans. And we were successful in, I think, 2 or 3 of those loans. It was federally backstopped. It was a pilot. And we worked so hard to get that, early on with some Alberta nations. And that was a huge success. But then it took the next 20 years to get to now the federal loan guarantee program. And I know that organizations like the First Nations Major Projects Coalition and other groups advocated tirelessly. Industry groups and industry leaders advocated for that program. We're seeing provincial loan guarantee programs and a number of other tools that are allowing finally Indigenous communities to be investors. And that creates that own source revenue, which then you can invest back into education and healthcare and elders and schools and other economic ventures. It creates wealth. Maybe we're going to actually get to a place in our country and within our nations where we're going to be managing wealth and not poverty for the first time, post-colonization. I'm very, very optimistic and excited by what I'm seeing. I think that if done right, Canada's on this incredible trajectory like we haven't seen in decades. We really can't squander that through not working with Indigenous communities, ending up in, prolonged and protracted legal processes and remedies. Court is a blunt instrument. We will miss the window. So I'm very optimistic about what I'm seeing in industry. Have seen a sea change in industry. I can even think 3 or 4 years ago, not that long ago, many corporations would have said, we would never have Indigenous equity in our operating or brownfield asset. It would have to be greenfield. Many of those same companies have changed their tune, and they're now, working actively for investment into existing assets. So we're seeing equity not just on new projects, but on existing. Significant shift in our thought patterns and how we work together. We have a long ways to go. And Rob, you talked about community capacity. I think that is something else I would point out, that as a proponent in this country, if you're going to build, you are going to have to invest not only in your internal teams, but in what the community needs, because community capacity continues to be a challenge, not for all nations, but certainly for many. So very optimistic. With the right ingredients, we're going to have a great outcome.
Well, I think you've defined this inflection point for Canada very well. That's our sense as well, and one of the reasons behind what we're doing, because we think this is a critical moment for the country. And if we all work together and achieve, Canada will become an exceptional place for the Indigenous people, and those who came after will have created something very unique in the North American continent and perhaps others. Just coming back briefly, Catherine, you're part of a global firm, KPMG. I'm not sure how much interaction you have with some colleagues internationally, but if you have had some interaction, what is their response when they hear about this Indigenous group in Canada moving things forward? How do you think globally KPMG has an awareness of that and reacts to that?
I think one of the advantages of working in a global firm, and a very global firm, is the commitment to continual learning from our colleagues in other parts of the world. So I can think about some of my colleagues in Australia, and we've actually had some recent exchanges where colleagues in Calgary were in Australia working with mining companies and identification of innovation around mining and also clean energy. And there's some incredible learnings that we can garner from that, and then them from us. I think there's going to be more and more opportunity to learn globally from one another. Indigenous communities work internationally. And I'm glad you actually asked this question, because lately I've been thinking a lot about, as a Canadian firm, am I and my peers thinking about this window that we have of opportunity, to your point, Mark, that if done right, is going to be the significant turning point for community involvement in projects, ownership, control, governance. And are we really looking enough at the international models? And I don't know that we are. And I think that's a real call to action for me and my peers to connect with other places that are still on their journey, but we could learn from. And we need to be able to move quickly. But what's the saying? Think slow, act fast. So I think we need to employ that.
Catherine Pennington, the Director of Indigenous Advisory Services at KPMG, thanks again for your time and your thoughtful comments this morning.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure to be here, and what an enriching conversation and dialogue. I look forward to continuing it.
Thank you. It was great to have you on our podcast, Catherine. We look forward to meeting you again in the near future. Thank you to Catherine Pennington for sharing her insights with us, and thank you for viewing and listening. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2026 Summit, taking place on the 8th of April. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.